Hello and welcome to Games for Discourse, where we talk about board games in a serious way. The aim behind this project is to recognize that board games, just like all other media we consume, is worthy of a critical lens. My name is Gabe Taylor, and today we're talking about Block by Block the Insurrection game, and its significance within the context of today's society. Block by Block is a semi-cooperative game where players take on the role of a particular community fighting for revolution. Each player may play as any one group, the workers, students, neighbors, or prisoners, but in all cases, the antagonist of the game is the state. Block by Block is a reflection of and inspired by modern-day protest movements, most significantly Oakland 2009, a story that disturbingly has become absolutely commonplace in America, the extrajudicial killing of a black person. In this particular case, it was 22-year-old Oscar Grant III who, while unarmed, detained, pinned on the ground by two police officers, was shot in the back, and the entire thing was caught on video. Protests erupted, and not just in Oakland, but across the country. There are four people I'd like to mention who were in Oakland during the ensuing protests. The first is Kat Brooks, who would later run for mayor of Oakland and found the Anti-Police Terror Project. She says,
I just kept watching it. I watched it over and over and over and over and over again. I got sick. I was shaking. I was so angry. I was crying. And it's what I've called since that time my enough moment. I just had enough. You know, he wasn't the first black man, certainly wouldn't be the last one to be killed by police, but there was something about him at that particular point in time, the brutality of it, the viral nature of the video.
The second person is Alicia Garza, who would go on to co-found the Black Lives Matter organization. She says, quote, when people tell the story of Black Lives Matter, they either start in 2014 with Mike Brown, or they start in 2013 with Trayvon Martin. But for us, it really does start with Oscar Grant. The third person is Rocket Lee, who wrote their thesis on designing game ethics, asking questions like, how does one design a game to make change? And how can I design a game that engages players in ethical gameplay? And fourth, T.L. Simons, who's an activist and graphic designer, lending his graphic design skills to organizations like the Oakland Museum, MoCA, ACCE, KALW, KPFA, all of which, in at least some capacity, are socially and racially progressive. Now, Kat Brooks and Alicia Garza are incredible individuals, and that's why I'm mentioning them. But more relevant to this video are the second two, Rocket Lee and T.L. Simons. I'm bringing them up because they are the two lead designers of Block by Block, and as they were living in Oakland at the time, they were surrounded by these protests for Oscar Grant. So they got together, and here's T.L. Simons.
We had this idea that a tabletop game would be uniquely suited to simulate this kind of social dynamic and this kind of social tension.
And so began the development of Block by Block. And while it may have been sparked by the protest for Oscar Grant in Oakland, it drew inspiration from several other modern protests, including Oaxaca, 2006, Athens, 2008, Cairo, 2011, Istanbul, 2013, and lastly, unfortunately, and poignantly bookended by the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, 2014, which came at the expense of Michael Brown, again, extrajudicially killed by a police officer. It's also important to note at the time of the recording of this video, we're in the midst of another wave of protests in America. Today's current protests were triggered by, and it just goes to show that nothing has changed, the extrajudicial killing of black individuals George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And from the filming of this video to the editing of this video, all of these individuals have been killed. While all of these protests that inspired the game, from Cairo to Oakland, are different, who is protesting, what they're protesting for, they're all tied together by a common thread. Every single one was met with police brutality. Which brings us to the core message Block by Block is trying to convey. 1. Oppressive power structures are a universal issue and the fight against them is a universal struggle. 2. People in positions of power will not seek to dismantle a system where they are in power. 3. It is up to the people without power to bring attention to oppressive power structures. 4. And most importantly, people in positions of power will actively resist any threat to dismantle the system where they are in power. If we look at these truths as sort of finite moments in the flow of a revolution, we can understand when exactly this game, Block by Block, takes place. We enter the game and the players have said, hey, here's a very real issue and it's messed up. That's number 3, bringing attention to oppression. And now, the response to that is police brutality. That's number 4, the active resistance to change. And that's where this game begins. So each player controls an oppressed group, a faction of revolutionaries, workers, neighbors, prisoners, or students, struggling together to liberate the city before time runs out and the military arrives. The enemy of all factions is the police, who, by design, exist to maintain the oppressive power structure. The players win if they're able to liberate the city, and the players lose if the military arrives before liberation. Now, this has all been a lot of context, but let's take a deeper look at the game itself. First and foremost, it has a really striking art style. Colorful, vibrant, which initially some might think is odd considering how depressing the circumstances that put you in a place of rebellion can be, but the artist and designer T.L. Simon says,
So I don't think uprisings are particularly depressing. I think a lot of times you see all this joy and sort of the collective liberation that happens within these movements.
And it's true. Coming together to fight a common issue, however dire it may be, creates joy, hope, solidarity. Speaking of solidarity, and now looking more closely at individual components, the raised clenched fist is a symbol that has historically stood for exactly that, solidarity. Solidarity in strength, solidarity in struggle. Within the context of the game, this pog acts as a way of occupying a location. This token represents your assembly hall, and it's how you get more supporters to join your cause. Another way to occupy a location in the game is with your faction start pog. The icon you see here depicts a lightning bolt arrow, but it's also known as the international squatter symbol. And you might ask, what's squatting? Well, in the context of revolution, it represents the idea that certain physical spaces have been taken away and withheld from a community. And after they're taken away, sometimes they're just kept empty. And to do that, to evict someone from a space only to keep it empty, that's a very real form of violence. So then, when people willfully occupy that space, they reclaim it, and their very presence becomes an act of protest. Another component in the game are some of these loot tokens. Looting is a mechanic that we'll talk about in a bit, but first we'll mention the tokens themselves. They represent some of the things you might see graffitied on a building during a mass movement. Everyone knows that A stands for anarchy, FTP, that's fuck the police, and here we have ACAB, stands for all cops are bastards. Seems like pretty radical stuff, but let's take a deeper dive. The most important thing to recognize here is that fuck the police, or all cops are bastards, is talking about the police as a system, as an institution. When people say all cops are bastards, it's really easy to hear that as a generalized statement about individual officers, but it just isn't. It's talking about the systemic racism of policing as an institution. The history of police in America is very much rooted in slave patrols. And while their name has changed over time, their role has not. The police in America patrol people of color's neighborhoods disproportionately, stop and frisk them disproportionately, profile, arrest, and kill them disproportionately. And the police, again, as an institution, are just one racist cog in a much larger racist machine known as the prison industrial complex, which sets bail higher for people of color, convicts people of color at higher rates, and sentences them for longer and harsher terms. If you want to learn more about the prison industrial complex, watching 13th by Ava DuVernay is a great place to start. Speaking of the police, another component in the game are the tokens representing the police. They're all white. Coincidence? Definitely not. Of course, we all know that not all cops are white. That would be ridiculous. But, and let me say this as clearly as possible, police exist to maintain the power dynamics within a system. And the current system is, and always has been, white, wealthy people at the very top. And we can see exactly that if we look at what gets policed and what doesn't. The lowest level crimes in America committed by the poorest people receive the heaviest policing and the harshest penalties, while white and wealthy people who commit much more consequential crimes often receive lighter sentences in comparison, if at all, because every single aspect of the American legal system, from writing laws to enforcing laws, by design, favor the white and wealthy. So this is the game's way of acknowledging the reality of our society, that the existence of police symbolize and perpetuate a system of white supremacy. The last component of the game that I'd like to mention is where all of this takes place, the board itself, which isn't a board at all. It's fabric and it doubles as a bandana, which you can use if you just so happen to find yourself at a protest. Bandanas can be really good for concealing your identity and protecting yourself from tear gas, and it's a pretty cool addition to the theming of the game. Okay, so that was a look at some of the components. Now let's take a look at some of the mechanics of the game and how they parallel and reflect the real world. The first mechanic we'll talk about is also the premise of the game, liberating the city. As you liberate certain areas of the city, you get to discover the narrative of your rebellion. For instance, here are some cards: Mega March, Disrupted Police Communication, and Street Parties. And here are the real-life parallels. We've all seen the Mega Marches, And here's people in Chicago hacking into police radios. And here's a street party in Oakland. The game is a reflection of real life. Okay, the second mechanic is movement. It's very easy to move in block by block. You're not limited by the value on the dice. You can move any number of spaces with any number of units. You can even use public transportation. Block by block makes movement this easy to directly reflect just how quickly protesters can mobilize. Here's a real-life example from Japan, where they call their mobility the be water strategy.
In order to evade the police, it means that they move quickly rather than occupying a single location. You can see that in this video. A large group of protesters entering a train station so they can travel to another area. And here, riot police have just arrived to disperse a crowd that has already left.
Again, the game is a reflection of real life. Okay, the next mechanic in block by block is police morale. It can go up and down depending on what's happening in-game. And as police morale gets higher, their in-game and also real-life retaliation can go from bold to brutal to downright deadly. On the other hand, as you resist the police, their disposition can go down to timid, which is exactly what happened in Atlanta, where police were nervous about being outnumbered 4-1. And here's another example from New Orleans, where a crowd surrounded a police car and demanded the release of a peaceful protester. Again, the game is a reflection of real life. Another interesting mechanic is the idea that players play as different groups with different agendas. They win the game in different ways, and their agenda is kept hidden. From a gameplay standpoint, this is great because it keeps the dynamics at the table cooperative but also competitive. It keeps people from taking control and quarterbacking gameplay like you might get in some other games like Pandemic. But also, it makes sense from a thematic standpoint. People within movements have different motivations and end goals, and Block by Block's designer T.L. Simmons mentions exactly that.
Politically, it just makes sense that, we're not trying to paint a really rosy picture here of these really conflictual and complex events. We want to show that within uprisings, there's all kinds of sectarianism and tension, and that determines the outcome of these things as much as police repression does.
Which is true. In America's current protests, some people want to abolish the police, some people want to defund the police, some people want reform. Some people protest by marching and speaking, some people have been angry and marginalized for so long that they're rioting and looting. The point of this mechanic, playing as different groups with different agendas, it's a reflection of reality. A movement is not a monolith of thought. Speaking of different ways people protest, another mechanic in the game is looting, which I mentioned before. I'm speaking on it last because it's a complex topic and I want to give it the time it deserves. Now, the definition of looting, pretty simply, is taking goods or resources that don't belong to you. So let's just take a step back and look at resources in games in general. Most games have resources. In fact, it's sort of hard to have a game without resources. Games might have just one abstract resource like letters, or they might have a ton of resources. But it's safe to say that resources are really common in games. Managing those resources in some efficient way is usually the base of some strategy. But in all of these games, with all of these resources, let's ask ourselves as honestly as possible, how do the players acquire these resources? Take a look at Settlers of Catan, one of the most famous modern board games. Your resources are ore, sheep, brick, wood, and wheat. And you get those resources by killing, stealing, exploiting, by looting Catan. That might be a bold statement to you, and you might say, what are you talking about? The premise of the game is explorers settling an island. And you're right. And while Catan may be fictional, you don't think anybody lived there before you came and settled it? Think of that word, settled, for just a moment. What else was settled? America, Australia, New Zealand, India, Hawaii, Madagascar? The list goes on and on. But in all of these cases, all these places being quote-unquote settled, people lived in those places beforehand. Those lands were not empty. Here's Eddie Izzard.
We stole countries with the cunning use of flags. Yeah. Just sail around the world and stick a flag in. I claim India for Britain. They go, you can't claim us, we live here. 500 million of us. Do you have a flag?
So that land, those resources, were stolen and exploited. They were looted. So a lot of games do in fact have looting mechanics. We just don't call it looting. I bring this up for 3 reasons. First, don't freak out when you hear the word loot, either on the news or in this game. The mechanic is no different from any other game. Second, language is important. We as a society need to be really cognizant of the language we're fed and the language we use. All too often we're using very different words that come with very different connotations depending on if the people we're talking about are people of color or white, even if they're doing the exact same thing. When a government takes what doesn't belong to them, it's settling or colonizing, but when people of color do it, they're looting. When a white person moves to another country, they're an expat, but if you're a person of color, you're an immigrant. When groups of white people go out into the street and flip and burn cars, they might be drunk revelers or rowdy fans, but when people of color do it, they're thugs, rioting. When a white person commits a mass shooting, they're portrayed as a mentally troubled lone wolf, but when a person of color commits a mass shooting, they're immediately identified as a terrorist, representing their entire race or their entire religion. When we use different words based on the skin color of the person we're talking about, we perpetuate a system that demonizes people of color and normalizes white supremacy. Language matters. Thirdly, and most importantly on the topic of rioting and looting, if you're someone who doesn't think rioting has any place in America, look at history. We're a country founded on riots. Throwing tea from English ships into the Boston Harbor to protest tax, the Boston Tea Party, that was a riot. And if you're someone who doesn't think riots are effective, America's current protests have made progress. Cases against officers are being reopened and cities are more widely considering alternatives to heavy policing. And if you're someone who is still uncomfortable with violent acts like rioting or looting, that's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable with violence. But if you are more vocal about your displeasure of rioting and looting than you are with the killing of people of color, that is a problem. You're more upset about the reaction to a problem than the problem itself, and you should reassess on what issues you are most vocally upset about. Activist and author Kimberly Jones explains it well.
People are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why.
And why might a person loot? It all comes down to the idea of a social contract. Here's Trevor Noah.
Society is a contract. Amongst this group of us, we agree in common rules. Some members of that society, namely Black American people, watch time and time again how the contract that they have signed with society is not being honored. When you watch Ahmaud Arbery being shot and you hear that those men have been released, and were it not for the video and the outrage, those people would be living their lives, what part of the contract is that in society? When you see George Floyd on the ground and you see a man losing his life in a way that no person should ever have to lose their life, at the hands of someone who's supposed to enforce the law, what part of the contract is that? There is no contract if law and people in power don't uphold their end of it. And so if the example law enforcement is setting is that they do not adhere to the laws, then why should the citizens...
Why should marginalized civilians be civil? The contract they've signed says they'll be provided life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but America breaks that contract every single day. America provides death, incarceration, and constant anxiety. America breaks the contract.
So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the f*** do I give a shit about burning the Football Hall of Fame, about burning the Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a f***.
On top of that, Mark Lamont Hill, author and activist, describes why looting, while it may be destructive, is a rational act within the context of a revolution.
The point even of damaging property is a form of scarring public tissue. It's a way of taking something that is ordinary, and sadly Black death is ordinary in this country, and making it unusual, creating a spectacle around it, drawing attention to it. And many activists feel that if they march, if they have marathons, if they hashtag, if they do all of these things, the nation doesn't notice. It's only when property is damaged, or it's only when other people begin to feel the level of discomfort that Black people feel that they get attention. So when you see someone breaking a store window, or you see someone spray painting on a wall, it's not that the actual wall of the particular store is the point, it's the bigger political project.
So rioting is not senseless destruction. It's a cry for help. People riot when all other avenues for social change have gone ignored. Comedian James Davis spotlights it here.
Rioting is not plan A. It's plan C. Plan A is telling America, hey, there's some messed up stuff going on, and we hope they hear it. Plan B is showing footage of the messed up stuff we have been talking about, and we hope that's digested. But if plan A don't work, and plan B don't work, we're gonna have to burn something.
When Colin Kaepernick and other football players protested peacefully, they were blackballed from the league. When Kobe Bryant and LeBron James and other basketball players protested peacefully, they were told to
shut up and dribble.
And when hundreds of thousands of people marched, they were ignored. So it is absolutely ridiculous and downright disrespectful to wag a finger and say, you need to protest peacefully, when that's what they were doing in the first place. And not only were they ignored, but they faced exile and ridicule for having the nerve to stand up against injustice. America has consistently shown that it just doesn't care about peaceful protests. And all of this is directly paralleled by what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said about riots.
That a riot is the language of the unheard.
So what aren't we hearing? Instead of asking, why do they loot? Why do they riot? We should instead say, what are they asking for that we aren't hearing, that we aren't providing? And the answer is so simple. Equality, justice, inclusion. That's what Block by Block is all about. Thank you so much. This has been Games for Discourse, where we talk about board games in a serious way, and you made it to the end of the video. You might be asking yourself, so what can I do? Here's 3 things. 1, keep your eyes, ears, and mind open. You can always be learning more. Watching 13th by Ava DuVernay on Netflix is a great place to start. 2, support more designers and play more games outside the narrative you're used to. Omari Akil is an incredible designer with games like Rap Gods and Hoop Gods. T.L. Simons, who worked on Block by Block, also worked on Strike, the Game of Worker Rebellion. 3, diversify your playgroup and talk about the stuff in this video and what's happening in the world around you. Don't be afraid to have real conversations. Alright, if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. If you want to look into any of the things I mentioned, I attached some references in the description below. And lastly, if you have a thoughtful response, feel free to leave a comment. Thanks. Bye.